4th of July, 1961, North Atlantic Ocean, southeast of Greenland. Soviet ballistic missile submarine, K-19, the Widowmaker, executes a deterrent patrol beneath Cold War waters. In the reactor compartment, gauges show routine readings, pressurizer indicators hold steady. Then, at 0415, pressure collapses. The primary coolant circuit drops to zero. Circulation pumps fail. Engineers expect emergency systems to respond, backup cooling, redundant loops, designed safety margins. Instead, they discover a truth the rushed construction schedule concealed. No backup cooling system exists. The reactor is shut down, but decay heat continues rising. Temperature climbs toward 800 degrees Celsius, near fuel rod melting point. Long-range radio is already disabled by separate failure. No rescue coordination, no engineering guidance from shore. In the sealed steel hull, 30 meters below the surface, the crew faces a choice measured not in hours but in minutes, and in the radiation dose each minute will cost. 1958 through November 12, 1960. Severodvinsk shipyards, Northern Fleet bases. The Soviet Union races to field a credible sea-based nuclear deterrent. Project 658, Hotel-class submarines, represents the first generation of Soviet ballistic missile boats. K-19 is among the first, designated for prestige patrols that signal strategic parity with the West. Construction records later reviewed in open sources describe schedule compression. Engineers work under directives that prioritize launch dates over comprehensive testing. Quality control protocols are abbreviated. Systems intended as redundant backups are deferred or simplified. The Los Angeles Times later reports a fact that will define the accident. Engineers had installed no backup cooling system for the reactor plant. Captain First Rank Nikolai Vladimirovich Zateyev assumes command. He inherits a platform whose deterrent value depends on secrecy and perceived invulnerability. Any technical failure becomes not merely an engineering problem, but a strategic liability. Evidence of vulnerability in a program designed to project strength. K-19 carries 2 pressurized water reactors and nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles. The propulsion plant operates inside a pressure hull with limited space, minimal shielding between compartments, and bulkhead doors that must remain operable for damage control. Design intent assumes that emergency cooling can be activated if primary circulation fails. That assumption rests on hardware that was planned but not fully installed. By July 1961, K-19 operates in the North Atlantic near southern Greenland, conducting exercises meant to demonstrate readiness. The crew operates under normal patrol routines. Watch rotations, instrument checks, maintenance logs, stamped with the same procedural discipline as any naval reactor plant. The contrast is stark. Externally, this is a controlled demonstration of Soviet naval power. Internally, later accounts describe a platform operating with known risks, systems incomplete, redundancies absent, and a construction history that traded thoroughness for speed. On the morning of July 4th, the exercise proceeds as planned. Weather conditions are routine, strategic profile remains normal, and then at 0415, reactor instrumentation registers an anomaly that turns routine into crisis. Primary coolant pressure dropping rapidly towards zero. 4th of July, 1961. K-19 reactor plant, North Atlantic exercises. Inside the reactor compartment, watchstanders monitor the primary circuit. A pressurized water reactor depends on maintaining pressure to prevent coolant from boiling. Pressure control keeps water subcooled. Forced circulation transfers heat from the reactor core to steam generators. The system is designed with layers. Pressurizer maintains pressure, pumps ensure circulation, instrumentation provides continuous status. The expectation is stable operation with predictable margins. Operators train for transients, but those scenarios assume that safety systems respond as designed. At 0415, the pressure gauge begins falling. Not a gradual drift, a rapid collapse. Within minutes, indication shows pressure at zero. Circulation pumps lose suction. Flow through the core stops. This is the signature of a major rupture in the primary circuit, a loss of coolant event. Engineering analysis depends on what can be confirmed versus what must be inferred. Confirmed. Pressure to 0. Pumps failed. Emergency shutdown rods inserted. Inferred. The size and location of the leak. The rate of coolant inventory loss, whether voiding or boiling is occurring in the core region. The Cornell University exhibit documenting K-19 states the condition plainly. Water pressure in the cooling system dropped to 0 and the coolant pump subsequently failed. This is not a transient that allows time for procedural responses. This is a casualty that compresses decision timelines into minutes. A naval pressurized water reactor operates on the same physics as land-based plants, but with critical differences. Space is constrained. Shielding is limited. External support is unavailable. Containment is not a reinforced concrete structure. It is the hull and bulkheads of the submarine itself. After emergency shutdown, scram, the chain reaction stops. Fission power drops immediately, but a second heat source remains, decay heat from radioactive fission products in the fuel. These isotopes, iodine, cesium, short-lived daughters, continue generating heat. Even at a small percentage of prior operating power, decay heat is sufficient to drive temperatures upward if cooling is not maintained. The core must be cooled continuously. Shutdown ends the fission reaction. It does not end the thermal hazard. Without forced circulation, fuel temperatures begin climbing. The question facing the engineering watch is immediate. Can cooling be restored before fuel cladding fails? 4th of July, 1961. K-19, reactor compartment boundary. Engineering officers confer with the captain. The reactor is shut down, but temperature is rising. Standard procedure calls for activating backup cooling, a secondary system designed to remove decay heat when primary circulation is lost. The Los Angeles Times reports the fact that defines what follows. Engineers had installed no backup cooling system. The redundancy assumed in design doctrine does not exist as installed hardware. This is the moment when procedure gives way to improvisation. If there is no designed emergency cooling path, the crew must create one. That decision converts a reactor casualty from a procedural response into a fabrication project, one that must be executed inside a contaminated high-radiation space, under time pressure dictated by rising fuel temperature. The absence of backup cooling is not merely an engineering shortfall. It is the single fact that determines every subsequent decision: who enters the compartment, for how long, and under what radiological conditions. A technical report later analyzing the incident describes the operational constraint. The only containment available was the hull and the bulkheads. In a land-based reactor, containment buildings provide shielding and separation. At sea, compartment boundaries are the only barrier, and during an emergency, those boundaries must remain permeable, doors open for firefighting, for routing equipment, for access. Mikhail Gorbachev's letter to the Nobel Committee decades later frames the casualty in stark terms. The crew had to assemble a pipeline which was not envisaged by the submarine project to feed drinking water for the cooling of the reactor. This is not standard damage control. This is field engineering under dose constraints. The improvised solution requires cutting into available piping, routing a water supply, welding connections, and establishing flow to the reactor vessel. Each step must be done correctly. A failed weld means the system does not cool. A misaligned valve means no flow. And every minute spent inside the compartment adds to accumulated dose. Reactor temperature continues climbing. Without intervention, the core will reach conditions where fuel cladding integrity is threatened. If cladding fails, fission products are released into the coolant. If containment boundaries are breached, contamination spreads throughout the submarine. The timeline is no longer measured in hours. It is measured in the minutes it takes for heat to overcome material limits. 4th of July, 1961. North Atlantic, K-19 operating area near southern Greenland. The reactor casualty is immediately complicated by a second failure. The long-range radio system is inoperative. The Cornell exhibit states this plainly. A separate accident had disabled the long-range radio system. K-19 cannot communicate with its home base. The submarine is isolated. In normal casualty response, a submarine reports its status, requests technical guidance, and coordinates rescue or rendezvous. Communication links the boat to shore-based engineering expertise, medical facilities, and strategic command. Radio failure removes all of those resources. Captain Zateyev faces a decision compressed by isolation. There is no time to await instructions. There is no external engineering authority to validate improvised solutions. The submarine is operating in waters where NATO anti-submarine forces maintain surveillance. Any ambiguous signal, loss of position, unusual activity, radiation release, can be interpreted through the lens of Cold War suspicion. Gorbachev's letter explicitly places the incident in geopolitical context. The accident occurred near the island of Jan Mayen, where a NATO base was located. The submarine carries nuclear weapons. An uncontrolled reactor event could create signals, steam release, loss of depth control, contamination detected by external sensors, that demand rapid interpretation by both sides. The Bellona Foundation's summary captures the operational bind. The crew could neither call for nor accept American help. Even if US forces detected distress, Soviet doctrine and secrecy requirements preclude requesting foreign assistance for a strategic platform. The Cold War framework turns a technical casualty into a crisis of isolation. Without radio, the decision loop is internal. The captain, the engineering officers, and the reactor department become the only available system of governance. There is no external check, no confirmation of approach, no second opinion from designers who built the plant. The response must be self-contained. The combination of reactor failure and communication failure creates a cascade. Time pressure from rising temperature, isolation from guidance, strategic risk from proximity to NATO operations, and a crew that must solve a problem no training scenario anticipated. If pressure cannot be restored and cooling cannot be improvised, the outcome is predetermined. The reactor will damage its fuel, contamination will spread, the submarine may become uncontrollable, and the first indication to outside observers might be a radiological signature in waters where submarines are tracked as potential threats. The clock is running, the compartment temperature is climbing, and the only solution available is the one the crew can build. 4th of July, 1961, K-19, Reactor Instrumentation Panel. The emergency shutdown has stopped the chain reaction. Control rods are fully inserted. Fission power is 0. But the temperature trend does not reverse. Cornell's summary documents the key metric. The reactor temperature rose, reaching 800 degrees Celsius, almost the melting point of the fuel rods. This number defines the hazard. At this temperature, fuel cladding integrity is threatened. Zircaloy. Cladding can begin oxidizing rapidly. Structural strength decreases. If temperatures continue rising, cladding can fail, releasing fission products into the coolant. The expectation after scram is that decay heat can be managed by residual circulation or natural convection. The reality aboard K-19 is that forced circulation has stopped and no backup system is available. Decay heat, though only a fraction of full operating power, is enough to drive temperature upward without heat removal. This is reactor physics without drama. After shutdown, radioactive isotopes in the fuel continue decaying. Iodine-131, cesium-137, and dozens of short-lived fission products generate heat as they decay. In the first hours after shutdown, decay heat may be 5 to 7% of prior operating power. That is enough to require active cooling. Engineering officers face a measurement problem and a time problem. Instrumentation shows temperature, but not all sensors may be reliable at these conditions. The crew must infer core conditions from indirect indicators, temperature trends, pressure behavior, any steam or gas behavior near relief pathways. The temperature reading of 800 degrees Celsius is more than a number. It is a threshold. Above this temperature, the response shifts from repair and restore to prevent irreversible damage. If fuel damage occurs, the accident escalates from a coolant system failure to a radiological event. Fission products in the coolant mean contamination throughout the primary circuit. If steam or gases carry fission products beyond the reactor compartment, contamination spreads to adjacent spaces, control areas, crew quarters, weapons compartments. Shutdown was the first step. It removed the largest heat source, but it did not stop the accident. Decay heat makes shutdown the beginning of the emergency, not the end. The numbers leave no ambiguity. Without cooling, The temperature will continue rising. Without a backup system, cooling must be improvised. An improvisation inside a high-radiation, high-temperature compartment means exposing personnel to conditions where time limits are measured in minutes, not hours. The reactor can be stabilized, but only if the crew can build a cooling system that does not exist, and only if they can do it before the fuel fails. 4th of July, 1961. K-19, reactor compartment and adjacent spaces. The decision is made. If a backup cooling system was not installed, the crew will build one. Gorbachev's letter describes the task assigned by Captain Zateyev to assemble a pipeline, which was not envisaged by the submarine project, to feed drinking water into the system for the cooling of the reactor. This is not metaphor. This is a literal construction project, cutting pipe, fitting connections, welding joints, establishing a flow path from available water reservoirs to the reactor vessel. The Bologna Foundation confirms the system gap. There was no built-in emergency system for supplying coolant to the primary circuit. What follows is field fabrication under the worst possible conditions. The engineering requirements are straightforward. Identify a water source. Drinking water tanks are the only large accessible reservoir. Route piping through bulkheads and into the reactor compartment. Cut and weld connections to valve assemblies. Ensure the path is leak-tight. Establish flow and verify cooling effect. Each step must be executed correctly. A failed weld means the system does not function. A misaligned valve means no flow. A miscalculated routing means the work must be repeated. And all of this must be done inside a compartment where radiation levels are climbing. The Los Angeles Times reports the operational method. 3-man brigades were formed to work for 5 to 10 minutes each. This is not a work schedule. It is a dose management protocol. Exposures are too high for extended stay. The only way to limit individual dose is to rotate teams. One group enters, works briefly, exits. The next group continues the task. Cornell notes that protective equipment was inadequate. The crew used chemical suits and gas masks, not radiation suits. These provide no shielding against gamma radiation. They may limit intake of airborne contamination, but they do nothing to reduce external dose rate. The primary protection is time. Minimize minutes in the field, maximize distance when possible, and accept that exposure is unavoidable. Work begins. Pipe is cut. Fittings are aligned. Welding arcs light in the dim compartment. Each team completes a segment of the task, then exits to allow the next team entry. Progress is measured in completed joints, verified connections, flow paths, extended toward the reactor. But the work itself creates a secondary hazard. To move tools, route piping, and access valve points, bulkhead doors must remain open. Steam and gases from the overheated reactor can now move through open pathways. Contamination spreads beyond the reactor room. The act of cooling the reactor distributes radiological hazard throughout adjacent spaces. 4th and 5th of July, 1961. K-19, control room and compartments adjacent to the reactor section. The repair work continues in rotations. Teams enter, work under time limits, and exit. The pipeline takes shape. But radiation readings are not confined to the reactor compartment. Monitors detect elevated levels in spaces that should be shielded. Control areas, passageways, crew berthing. The pattern suggests that contamination is spreading. A technical report analyzing the incident later provides the structural explanation. The only containment available was the hull and the bulkheads, and bulkhead doors had to be opened during firefighting and repair work. This created direct transport routes for gases, steam and aerosols carrying fission products. Bologna's summary describes the exposure pathway. Radiation exposure among the crew came primarily from contaminated gases and steam. The source is the overheated reactor. If fuel cladding has been compromised, even partially, fission products can escape into the coolant and volatilize into steam or gas. Those gases move through any open route. During normal operations, compartment boundaries limit spread. Doors are closed, ventilation is controlled. During an emergency, boundaries must be open to allow access, firefighting, and equipment routing. That access converts compartment isolation into a network of contamination pathways. The technical inference chain is documented. High radiation levels outside the reactor room suggest that fission products were released before the improvised cooling system became operational. If fuel had remained intact, coolant activity would drop rapidly after shutdown. Persistent high readings imply fuel damage occurred during the temperature excursion, meaning contamination was already present in the steam and gases by the time repair work began. Cornell notes that contamination affected not only the crew, but also portions of the submarine's equipment, including some of the ballistic missiles. This is significant. It demonstrates that the contamination pathway extended beyond the propulsion spaces into weapons areas. A reactor accident has now affected the strategic payload. The crew's exposure is unavoidable. Work teams entering the reactor compartment receive the highest doses: direct exposure to damaged fuel, contaminated systems, and high radiation fields near the reactor vessel. Personnel moving through adjacent spaces, handling tools, or working near open bulkheads receive lower but still significant exposures from contaminated gases and surfaces. Dose accumulates with each entry, each minute in the field, each task completed. Dosimetry badges, if worn, record the totals. But in many cases, the crew may not have precise real-time dose information. They know exposure is high, they know time must be minimized, and they know the work must continue, because stopping means the reactor temperature continues climbing. The repair mission and the dose consequence are inseparable. To save the submarine, the crew must accept exposure. To limit exposure, the crew must work faster, and to work faster inside a high radiation compartment means more personnel must rotate through, spreading the dose burden across more individuals, but also expanding the number of people contaminated. 4th through 7th of July, 1961, K-19 at sea, rendezvous and tow operations. After hours of work, the improvised cooling system is completed. Flow is established. Temperature begins dropping. Gorbachev's letter documents the outcome. After 2 hours of work on the construction of this pipeline, the temperature in the reactor fell to the level that could be measured by the control equipment. The system works. Cooling is restored. The reactor is thermally stabilized. But the same letter states the radiological reality. The level of radiation in the reactor compartment was extremely high. Stabilization is not the same as safety. The thermal crisis is controlled, but the exposure crisis has already occurred. Cornell identifies the personnel involved. A team of 7 engineering officers and crew work to implement the new cooling. These are the individuals who receive the highest exposures: direct work inside the reactor compartment, under conditions where dose rates were measured in sieverts per hour, not millisieverts. Within days, the first medical casualties become evident. Soviet naval medical protocols require transfer of exposed personnel for treatment. K-19 coordinates rendezvous with other vessels. The most severely exposed sailors are transferred off the submarine. Towing arrangements are made to bring K-19 back toward the Kola Peninsula and its base facilities. The logistics are constrained by weather, strategic concerns, and the need to maintain secrecy. A technical report notes that accounts differ on the sequence. Some sources describe transfer of exposed personnel first, followed by towing. Others suggest partial crew transfer during storm conditions. The outline presents these as documented uncertainties, variations in source testimony rather than a single authoritative narrative. What is consistent across sources? The submarine is stabilized and returned to base, but the crew's exposure has already determined medical outcomes. For those who entered the reactor compartment repeatedly, who worked closest to the damaged core, who spent the most minutes in the highest fields, dose totals are irreversible. The measure of success is mixed. The submarine did not suffer a catastrophic reactor failure. The core did not melt. The hull remained intact. The strategic mission, though aborted, did not escalate into an international incident. But success is measured in lives. Gorbachev's letter states plainly, 8 members of the crew died within the following days and weeks. The Los Angeles Times reports a broader toll. Of the 139 crew members, 22 died of radiation poisoning, 8 in a matter of days, the rest over the next 2 years. The numbers vary by source and time frame. Some accounts list casualties within the first month. Others include deaths over years as radiation-induced cancers and organ failures develop. The documentary approach is to present the ranges and acknowledge uncertainty, while recognizing that even conservative figures represent a significant casualty toll. The improvised cooling system prevented an immediate catastrophe. It did not prevent the human cost. Thermal stabilization came at the price of exposure, dose that, for some, was incompatible with survival. July 1961, K-19, post-casualty analysis. As the submarine returns to base, investigators and technical analysts begin reconstructing what occurred. Radiation readings from the control room, far from the reactor compartment, become a key piece of evidence. A technical report analyzing the incident states the inference directly. High radiation in the control room seems to indicate that the only containment was the hull and the bulkheads, and that bulkhead doors had to be open, so spread could not be prevented. But the same report draws a more significant conclusion about fuel condition. The analysis chain is straightforward. If the reactor fuel had remained undamaged during the accident, radioactivity levels in the control room should have dropped within a few minutes after circulation was restored. The documented reality is that radiation levels remained high. This pattern indicates that the fuel was damaged and fission products released before the new cooling system came into operation. This is the technical climax of the incident. The goal was to prevent fuel damage by restoring cooling, but the reconstruction evidence suggests that fuel damage occurred during the temperature excursion, likely when core temperatures reached 800 degrees Celsius and cladding integrity was compromised. Fuel damage changes the character of the event. Instead of a coolant system failure with contamination limited to the primary circuit, K-19 experienced a fission product release that contaminated multiple compartments. Cornell's summary confirms this. Contamination affected crew members, parts of the submarine, and some of the ballistic missiles. The contamination pattern has long-term consequences. If fission products are embedded in submarine structure, equipment, and ventilation systems, decontamination may be impractical. If missiles are contaminated, they may require replacement or extensive refurbishment. If the reactor compartment itself has high residual activity, defueling and repair become high-dose operations, or may not be feasible at all. The inference about fuel damage is not speculation. It is based on radiation behavior. Intact fuel retains fission products. Damaged fuel releases them. High readings in spaces separated from the reactor by bulkheads and shielding imply that fission products move through steam, gas, and ventilation pathways, which requires that they escape the fuel matrix during the casualty. This technical conclusion explains later Soviet decisions. A contaminated reactor compartment that cannot be effectively decontaminated becomes a disposal problem. A submarine whose strategic value is compromised by contamination becomes a refit candidate, not a simple repair case. The crew's improvisation succeeded in stopping the temperature rise. It did not succeed in preventing the release. The timeline was too compressed. The temperature climbed too fast. By the time cooling was restored, the fuel had already begun releasing fission products. The documented outcome is therefore dual: operational success in preventing total core melt and strategic success in avoiding an international incident, but radiological failure in containing fission products and human failure in protecting the crew from lethal exposures. The event has moved beyond engineering casualty. It is now a radiological contamination incident, a medical crisis, and a strategic problem whose resolution will require years, and whose consequences will appear on the Arctic seabed decades later. 4th of July, 1961, and 45 years later. The incident's strategic dimension is best understood not through the immediate response, but through a later retrospective that places the accident in Cold War context. On February 1st and 2nd, 2006, former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev submitted a letter to the Norwegian Nobel Committee nominating the crew of K-19 for the Nobel Peace Prize. The letter provides the geopolitical framing that was suppressed in 1961, but acknowledged decades later. Gorbachev describes the location and timing. The accident occurred in the Norwegian Sea near the island of Jan Mayen, where a NATO base was located. A Soviet nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed ballistic-missile submarine suffered a reactor casualty in proximity to NATO surveillance facilities during the height of Cold War tensions. The letter states the escalation risk explicitly. An explosion in the submarine could have been taken by NATO as an attempt to launch a nuclear strike against a NATO country. Such an explosion could have triggered the beginning of a Third World War. This is not hypothetical framing. It reflects operational Cold War reality. Submarines were continuously tracked. Any ambiguous event, loss of contact, unusual activity, radiological signature, was evaluated for hostile intent. A reactor explosion, steam release, or loss of depth control could generate signals interpreted through strategic warning systems designed to detect attack indicators. Bellona's summary adds the doctrinal constraint: the crew could neither call for nor accept American help. Even if distress were detected, Soviet secrecy doctrine prohibited foreign assistance for a strategic platform. The submarine carried nuclear weapons. Its propulsion plant was classified. Its operating area and mission profile were state secrets. The combination of reactor failure, weapons presence, proximity to NATO facilities, and inability to communicate created a scenario where an accident could be misread as aggression. If K-19 had suffered a catastrophic reactor failure, explosion, sinking, or uncontrolled radiation release, NATO forces monitoring the area would have detected anomalous signals without context. The crew's success in stabilizing the reactor therefore had significance beyond saving the submarine. It prevented a scenario where ambiguous signals in a high-tension environment could have been misinterpreted as hostile action. Gorbachev's letter argues that the crew's actions helped avert a war between the two great powers possessing nuclear weapons. Whether this assessment overstates the escalation risk is debatable. What is documented is that Soviet leadership, years later, recognized the incident as having had strategic implications beyond the immediate casualty. The letter also reflects a shift in how the Soviet state framed the event. In 1961, the accident was suppressed to avoid acknowledging vulnerability. By 2006, it could be reframed as an example of restraint and professionalism under conditions that could have led to catastrophic misinterpretation. The Cold War context explains why the incident was kept secret for decades. Disclosure would have revealed design flaws, construction shortcuts, and operational risks in a prestige weapons system. It would have provided adversaries with intelligence about Soviet submarine capabilities and vulnerabilities, and it would have undermined the deterrent value that depended on perceived reliability and control. The strategic risk was not only the immediate accident, it was the possibility that weakness, once known, could be exploited or could create perceptions of instability that increased the chance of miscalculation. July 10th through 25th, 1961 and subsequent months. Soviet Naval Medical System, facilities near Polyarny, and specialized treatment centers. The crew members transferred from K-19 present with symptoms consistent with acute radiation syndrome. Acute radiation syndrome follows a predictable clinical course for high-dose exposures. Initial phase, nausea, vomiting, fatigue. Latent phase, temporary improvement. Manifest phase, bone marrow failure, hemorrhage, infection, gastrointestinal damage. For whole-body doses above 5 to 6 sieverts, survival becomes unlikely even with aggressive medical intervention. Gorbachev's letter documents the casualty count from the immediate period. 8 members of the crew died within the following days and weeks. The Los Angeles Times provides a broader tally. Of the 139 crew members, 22 died of radiation poisoning, 8 in a matter of days, the rest over the next 2 years. Dose reconstruction is complicated by incomplete records and deliberate obfuscation. Bellona reports that the most exposed individuals received doses on the order of 50 to 60 sieverts, well above lethal thresholds. Other accounts provide ranges rather than precise values, acknowledging uncertainty in dosimetry and source reliability. The medical response includes advanced interventions, blood transfusions, bone marrow transplants, infection control, and supportive care. But for the highest exposures, treatment can only delay outcomes, not reverse them. The physiological damage from high-dose radiation, destruction of bone marrow, gastrointestinal lining, and other rapidly dividing tissues is irreversible at certain dose levels. What is documented with consistency across sources is the institutional response: secrecy over transparency. Captain Zateyev, interviewed decades later, describes the system's behavior, Crew members were expected to lie to doctors about the cause of their symptoms. Medical histories were falsified. A specific diagnosis appears in later testimony. Survivors were diagnosed with asthenic vegetative syndrome, a vague neurological label that concealed radiation sickness. This diagnosis appears in official records, medical files, and pension documents. It allowed the state to provide some level of care while avoiding explicit acknowledgement of a radiological accident. Zatayev's summary, as reported in a 1993 interview, is blunt. That was the system. Hide everything. People suffered, died, and there was no reaction. The falsification has long-term consequences. Medical follow-up for radiation exposure requires accurate dose records, symptom tracking, and epidemiological study. Concealment impairs all of these. Survivors may not receive appropriate monitoring for delayed effects, cancers, organ damage, immune dysfunction. Families may not understand the cause of illness. And institutional learning, revising procedures, improving safety systems, training future crews, is delayed because the lessons cannot be openly discussed. The casualty count varies by how deaths are attributed and over what time frame. Immediate deaths from acute radiation syndrome are clearly linked. Deaths occurring months or years later from cancers or organ failures involve more uncertainty in causation. The documentary approach presents the reported ranges and acknowledges that source numbers differ. What is not uncertain is that the crew paid a human price for stabilizing the reactor. Those who entered the compartment earliest and most frequently received the highest doses. Those who worked closest to the reactor vessel, who welded the longest, who completed the critical joints, absorbed radiation that medical science could not reverse. The accident is therefore complete, a reactor casualty driven by missing redundancy, an improvised cooling response that succeeded technically, a contamination event that spread beyond the reactor room, and a casualty toll that was then administratively concealed for 3 decades. The submarine returned to base, the survivors were treated in secrecy, the dead were buried without public acknowledgement, and the official record stated that no such accident had occurred. 1961 through 1990. Soviet state secrecy apparatus. The accident aboard K-19 becomes a controlled narrative, controlled by suppression. Gorbachev's letter documents the concealment timeline. All information about this tragic incident was kept secret in the USSR until 1990. For 29 years, the accident does not exist in public record. It is not discussed in open literature, not mentioned in naval histories, not included in safety reviews that could inform other crews. The secrecy serves multiple purposes. It protects the perceived reliability of Soviet ballistic-missile submarines. It prevents NATO intelligence from gaining insight into Soviet submarine design weaknesses. It avoids domestic acknowledgement of construction shortcuts and missing safety systems. And it allows the state to avoid accountability for casualties that resulted from design and schedule decisions. Survivors are instructed not to discuss the event. Zatayev describes the expectations. Crew members were told to lie to doctors about radiation exposure. Medical records were falsified to list diagnoses that did not mention radiation. Pensions and benefits were provided under non-radiological categories. The Los Angeles Times reports Zatayev's summary of the institutional culture. That was the system. Hide everything. The suppression has operational consequences. Other submarine crews do not learn from K-19's experience. Design flaws are not openly corrected. Redundancy gaps are not filled with urgency. The reactor compartment itself becomes a technical problem that must be resolved in secret. By 1965, the decision is made. The damaged reactor compartment cannot be conventionally repaired. A technical report analyzing Soviet submarine disposal practices documents the outcome. The old reactor compartment on K-19 was cut off and dumped in the Kara Sea in 1965, with the fuel remaining in both reactors. This disposal method reflects the severity of contamination. Defueling a damaged reactor requires remote handling, shielding, and facilities capable of managing high-dose operations. If contamination levels inside the compartment are extreme, defueling may be impractical or impossible with available equipment. The decision to cut out the compartment and dump it indicates that conventional decontamination and defueling were not viable options. Bologna's reporting describes the disposal location. Abrosimov Bay, also called Abrosimov Gulf, in the Kara Sea near Novaya Zemlya. The reactor sections were mothballed by filling them with a furfural-based preservative, a chemical intended to seal fuel and prevent corrosion for extended periods. Bellona cites forecasts suggesting the seal could last as much as 500 years, though this is presented as a design claim rather than verified performance. The secrecy persists through the Cold War. The accident is known within Soviet naval circles, but it is not publicly acknowledged. Crew members who attempt to discuss it face repercussions. Medical follow-up is limited by the requirement to maintain the cover story. The turning point comes with Glasnost and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. In 1990, information about K-19 begins appearing in Russian media. Zateyev gives interviews. Survivors speak publicly. The accident transitions from suppressed event to historical case study. Gorbachev's 2006 letter to the Nobel Committee represents the final institutional reframing. The crew is nominated for recognition not as victims of a failure, but as individuals whose actions prevented escalation. The letter argues that they helped avert a war between the two great powers. The secrecy phase ends, but its consequences remain. Decades of suppressed data mean incomplete dose reconstruction. Survivors' health histories are fragmented, epidemiological study is limited, and the disposal site in the Kara Sea becomes a long-term environmental monitoring responsibility. The documentary record is now public, but it is incomplete. The full technical details of the reactor damage, the exact dose received by each crew member, and the decision-making process behind the disposal are partially reconstructed from interviews, later analysis, and declassified fragments. The narrative moves from operational event to historical memory. What was hidden for 3 decades is now documented, but documentation cannot reverse the outcomes: lives lost, health impaired, and a reactor compartment resting on the Arctic seabed. 1965 and 2021, Abrosimov Bay, Kara Sea, Novaya Zemlya region. The damaged reactor compartment from K-19, cut from the submarine and sealed, is dumped in shallow Arctic waters. Decades later, it becomes the subject of environmental monitoring and hazard assessment. Bellona's 2021 reporting describes a research expedition tasked with locating and evaluating dumped submarine reactor compartments. The expedition's stated purpose is clear. Our task is to find, map, and measure the level of danger from these objects, arrange monitoring of their condition, and ensure that the shell does not collapse. The compartment is not an isolated disposal. The Kara Sea contains multiple reactor sections from Soviet submarines, dumped during the Cold War when land-based storage was unavailable or impractical. K-19's compartment is one item in a broader legacy of underwater nuclear waste. The disposal method reflects the contamination severity documented in earlier chapters. A technical report analysing the incident chain provides the causal link. High radiation in the control room indicates that fuel was damaged and fission products were released. That contamination likely made defueling difficult or impossible with available technology in the 1960s. Bellona reports that the spent fuel was not offloaded from K-19's reactors before disposal. The technical report states more specifically, the compartment was dumped in 1965 with the fuel remaining in both reactors. This is presented with the caveat that source accounts vary, and that absolute certainty is limited by the secrecy surrounding the disposal operations. The preservation method is documented. Reactors were sealed by filling them with a furfural-based preservative. Furfural is an organic compound used as a corrosion inhibitor. The intent is to exclude seawater, prevent oxidation, and maintain compartment integrity long enough for radioactivity to decay. Bellona cites forecasts suggesting the seal could be effective for as much as 500 years. This is a forecast, not a guarantee. Seabed conditions, pressure, salinity, temperature, biological activity affect long-term containment. The question is whether the compartment shell and seal will outlast the period during which the fuel poses significant radiological hazard. The 2021 expedition represents a shift from disposal and forget to active monitoring. Russian authorities, in cooperation with international environmental organizations, are now registering the location, measuring radiation levels in surrounding seawater and sediment, and assessing structural integrity. The monitoring logic is precautionary. If the compartment shell corrodes and breaches, fission products could be released into the marine environment. Cesium-137, strontium-90, and other long-lived isotopes could enter food chains, accumulate in sediments, and pose exposure risks to local populations or ecosystems. The documentary conclusion is numerical and procedural. The K-19 accident chain can be traced step by step. Missing redundancy led to improvised cooling. Improvised cooling required high-dose work. High-dose work caused casualties. High temperatures and contamination led to fuel damage. Fuel damage created a reactor compartment too contaminated to defuel conventionally. Inability to defuel led to disposal at sea. Disposal at sea created a long-term monitoring obligation. The incident is not finished in 1961 or even in 1965. It continues as an environmental liability and a reminder of the material consequences of design choices made under schedule pressure. Gorbachev's letter closes the historical framing. A reactor catastrophe in the North Atlantic, near NATO facilities, aboard a nuclear-armed submarine, could have been misinterpreted as an attack and could have triggered a Third World War. The crew's improvisation prevented that outcome, but the physical evidence remains on the seabed. The compartment, the fuel, the fission products, the contaminated steel, all are archived in cold water, awaiting decay timelines measured in decades and centuries. The final symbol is not dramatic. It is a survey coordinate, a radiation measurement, a monitoring plan. It is the knowledge that an accident compressed into minutes on July 4, 1961, created consequences that will require attention long after the last crew member has died. K-19 is remembered as the Widowmaker, a name that reflects the human cost. But the documentary record shows that the incident was not fate or bad luck. It was the result of specific documented decisions to build without backup cooling, to operate under secrecy constraints, to rely on improvisation when design should have provided safety. The minute-by-minute timeline ended when cooling was restored. The minute-by-century timeline continues on the Arctic seabed.